Hello. Hello, and a very warm welcome and good evening to all joining us today for the fourth lecture under our Researchers Practice series. I'm Akanksha Rastogi, Senior Curator Programming and Exhibitions at the KNMA Museum of Art in New Delhi. I'm thrilled to welcome Saira Ansari today, who will be presenting her talk titled Critical Inquiry as Necessity, a Non-Expert Opinion. She's joining us from Dubai. Thank you, Saira, for agreeing to do this and to be part of the series, the first set under Researchers Practice, through which we at KNMA are hoping to survey various forms, formats, manifestations, and historiography of research practices in South Asian art, as well as the infrastructures of research and research networks that enable, push, form, relay, a coming together of certain materials, ideas, people, groups, questions, and methodologies. As many of you might know Saira already, she's an amazing writer and researcher, and I'm an admirer of her writing. You can follow her on her website. She has a fantastic website, which is very, very updated with all her recent projects. She often employs creative nonfiction to think about art practice and criticism, feminist histories, gardens, grief, science fiction, and South Asia. She's worked on and written for several print and digital publications and is the editor of upcoming monograph on Bindi. Saira's research focuses on Pakistani modernist Zubeida Agha, who was born in 1922 and passed away in 1997, and whose archive she documented, digitized, and researched on. And the archive is currently digitally hosted at the Asia Art Archive, Hong Kong, and the entire project was made possible through the Lahore Biennale Foundation Research Fellowship. She's taken on several research roles and positions in many exhibitions and galleries and institutions. Her collaborative curatorial projects include The Importance of Staying Quiet, made in Hong Kong in 2014, Within, Without in London in 2018, Moon Show in Dubai in 2018. And most recently, Saira worked at the Sharjah Art Foundation coordinating publications and the Focal Point Art Book Fair. Today, Saira will take us through her work on Zubeida Agha archive and some of the challenges she encountered and paths she navigated in documenting this modernist painter, patron, and institution builder, whose legacy has largely been underwritten and under-researched in Pakistan's cultural milieu. So Saira herself was trained as an artist and with a BFA from National College of Art in Lahore, Pakistan, and slowly moved towards research and writing. We hope to hear from her about the steep learning curve as an autodidactic researcher and then this position of a non-expert that she has taken in today's title. I'm curious to ask you about that. And she'll take us through her methodologies of navigating the fractures in art historical and contemporary narratives vis-a-vis gaps in pedagogical and institutional structures. You can put your questions to Saira in the Q&A box at any point during her presentation, and we'll make sure we take them up after her talk is over. And if you're watching us on Zoom or if you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to put your questions, comments, or thoughts in the comments box. We'll try and make sure they reach Saira too. Over to you, Saira, now.
Thank you so much, Akansha. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, got it. Okay. Thank you so much, first of all, Akansha, for the introduction and inviting me on this platform. And also to the KNMA for giving me this platform. I'm very honored to be here. But I have to start with something that I really dislike doing public talks. It's a great way to start, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Goodbye. No, but you know, I do speak in public, of course. I work, you know, I present papers or workshops or panels, but I really have a very strange discomfort in talking about my own work. And I don't really know how to talk about it. But the other thing is also this format of Zoom and video for me it feels like a very, the finality of it, of something going into perpetuity forever is something that really terrifies me, about making mistakes, especially when you're dealing with like, factual information. And so all of these things are there. So I have this entire khadda out papers that I'm going to be constantly referring to make sure, I got everything covered. But what I did want to say was that I mentioned all of this to you when you reached out. And one of the things that you said to me, like, the sense that I got was that these talks are meant for practitioners who are either already using or want to use research in their practice. And what does that mean, right? And so I think one of the first things I said to you in response, Akansha, was, I wish I knew a lot of the things I know now back then. And I wish someone had spoken to me about what the process is, more so than anything else. And perhaps my journey might have been a little less tumultuous, perhaps a little more graceful. One can always hope. And perhaps I wouldn't have felt so alone. A sense of community or support garnered by others would maybe have prevented me having to knock around the same obstacles again and again each time. And really, I hope that this is perhaps what we can achieve today. So I don't know who the audience is, both the joys and the pros and cons of Zoom. I have no idea who is listening in and what their expectations are. And I know this is a pretty long session because I've been asked to present for about 45 minutes and another half an hour probably of Q&A. And so I don't know how many of you will stay that long, to be honest, but I did want to put forward a summary of what I'll be talking about, which I think will be very useful. And I really wish I could do this in person because it feels realer and I feel like I can respond to the general mood of the audience, and perhaps even throw something at someone if they fall asleep, But, jokes aside, I think the presentation is divided into 4 parts. So it's very concise like that. In the beginning, I'm going to be talking about my background, my work experience, and what I did after I graduated. Because initially, like you also mentioned, I did have a studio practice. And that sort of evolved into what I'm doing now, which is writing and research and working on books. And a lot of people, often meet me and ask, yeah, you're not making art anymore. What happened? And I think that's a really fraught question because I think my writing is my practice. So I think I will talk about how my work changed and how I came to kind of incorporate research in this into my art practice. The second part is going to look at the Zubeida Agha archive grant, the process and the result. And it isn't really so much about the archive, but about the drive to make it happen, and the things I learned and the many, many mistakes I made along the way. Really nothing like self-deprecation to connect with some of the Lone Rangers in the audience who I'm sure are in the same boat. And then the third part is going to look at an example of how I use the archive to generate content, right? And then who was keen in supporting that, and also how I learned to love what research can really achieve for people like myself. And finally, the last bit kind of deals with this very, very tangible reality of what happens after you work on something which you think is very iconic and nothing climactic happens. So those are kind of the 4 parts that we're going to be covering today. And hopefully I can manage to cover my own experiences, technical, but also very importantly, logistical, financial, personal, and the mental health aspect of it, which I don't think are talked about enough in what we do. So the first part in the introduction, I think what immediately comes to my mind and in my particular trajectory is that I never really studied research methodologies or trained as a researcher. And almost the entirety of my practice kind of developed from my own persistent curiosity and a constant need to teach myself more, whatever that meant, right? More than whatever was being given to me. And the trigger for these was very much my disappointment with the institutional frameworks and to address any kind of critique of authoritative pedagogical models and the reliance solely or a lot on oral histories. And I'm not opposed to oral histories, of course, and learning to challenge kind of the Western canon. I have realized how important oral histories are to our cultures and our geography specifically. But the reality of it is what I felt then and sometimes do now, at that oral history is used as a tool for gatekeeping. And then a lot of times alternative narratives are suppressed in favor of the original story. Anyway, so I'm in art school. I haven't looked at these images in eons. This is when I was doing my BFA in NCA in 2004. I was majoring in painting, and my entire thesis had been kind of about challenging the expectation to produce scale-based artwork. And I was constantly quibbling with people. But I did have great support in my tutors, Nazir Shataula and Anwar Saeed at that time. And Anwar Saab specifically, and also Omar Bhatt, of how people know him, Brain Noise, but he was a thesis teaching assistant at that time. They were constantly pushing me to challenge more and more everything, and then to read a lot more, which was not something we did at NCA back then. And simultaneously, I was learning about abstract expressionism and through my adventures in the library. 50 years too late, granted, but it had such a profound impact on me and how I was thinking and producing. And I really felt like I was onto something when I graduated. And then nothing happened because work. And this is going to be like a passive aggressive thread running throughout the course of the evening, the session, that, you know, that is important to address, because it's the reality of a lot of people, you know, like having to work and what happens. So I had already started working in my thesis year to kind of earn cash for art supplies. But as soon as I graduated, I had to look at work and joined up a design firm started by another friend from school, and we needed money. So we took on a lot of and every kind of project. We worked insane hours, and in about a year's time, I was burnt out and I quit. And I know that this is the story of most art graduates who try to kind of find creative jobs and end up in these mill in a way. Anyway, so I joined the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan after that, because I still had to work, but I wanted to do something with meaning. And I worked alongside like stalwarts like Aya Rahman and Asma Jahangir. And that was the first time that under the kind of tutorship of Rahman Saab that I started working on research. What it meant to go through content, to primary content, to interviews, to oral histories, and to produce stuff. And, you know, I was given a lot of agency to do something with that material, and that was very interesting. And then also at HRCP, I was exposed to a lot of social theater, like Ajoka and other art and culture professionals who were involved in rights movements, and a lot of engagement with folks from across South Asia. So, you know, my interest was already expanding beyond Pakistan at this point. And for me, this is a very pivotal moment, which I consider as alternative learning. That was really has changed the way I look at things. And after conversations with a friend, dear friend and late artist and activist, Lala Rukh, I was inspired to kind of return back to NCA for the MA program that she had set up. But unfortunately for me, she had retired from it a year before I joined. So this is how I started. I joined with the intention to partake in critical discourse. And I found that the program kind of was changing tune and losing rigor. But if anything, the program and some of its really wonderful faculty taught me to articulate a lot of my anger through institutional critique. Again, another concept that I was half a century late to, but I employed it as a tool head on, taking no prisoners. But everything back then was so small and insular that, and probably still is, that critique was looked at as a personal attack. So obviously I made no fans doing that. And to be honest, I was quite a bit of a dick. I mean, I was young and impassioned, and I don't regret that energy. But I sometimes wonder where I had the bravado to question things, right? Things that I didn't really understand myself. So the instinct wasn't wrong, but picking up arguments based on instinct isn't enough. And I suffered because of that, which is when I had to retreat, re-strategize, and come back and, kind of learn to substantiate arguments, and, things like research are coming slowly into shape around this point. And I'm so sure now, looking at my time during my master's, that my anger seems very performative. And no matter how genuine my concerns were for critical dialogue, because I wasn't being very subtle about it, it was getting overshadowed by more drama than actual work. Anyway, I got invited to inhabit the Grey Noise Gallery space for about a month in about 2010 when they were in Pakistan, working through those ideas. And I had the strangest non-commercial exhibition, did a talk perched on top of a ladder and said the most strange things. And then from there started a blog, the essay project. In the early days of the blogosphere, where I critiqued exhibitions, curatorial frameworks, teaching methodologies, and I was exceptionally harsh on commercial galleries, I have to say. And the strangest thing happened. I was suddenly at the receiving end of immense amount of support and hate, equal parts. So I was receiving an exceptionally high amount of hits to the blog, as well as an overwhelming number of comments and private messages from young artists and students across Pakistan. But I was also beginning to hear how much I was pissing off faculty members and senior artists. So I received a large number of these shadow comments with pseudonyms, calling me all manner of rude names and accusing me of conspiracy theories. This thing we have in South Asia, this obsession with conspiracy theories, really is something to discuss separately. But it didn't bother me so much back then. And I think I will never, ever excuse my desire to critique. And I really loved working on the blog and the people I met through it and the kind of dialogue that was kind of engaged with. But I didn't realize that that reputation would follow me into my later work in kind of everything that I was doing. Anyway, so now I'm going to move on towards the second part, the Zubeida Agha archive, right? So now I'm in my MA many years later, and this is the first time I hear Zubeida Agha being discussed at NCA, which now I think it's crazy that that was like the first time. And my professor, Dr. Atika Ali, who wasn't from the usual art fraternity, brought with her certain elements of critical thinking that were new to me. And she was the first person to say to me, Zubeida Agha is important. And then when she found out I was the grandniece of Agha, she kind of told me to get up and do something about it, right? To kind of address this really ridiculous black hole in our history books. But except apart from a few papers in class, I didn't really know what else to do or where to publish them. So fast forward a few other years, I'm in Dubai now, it's 2014, and I got enrolled in a 6-month-long critical thinking platform alongside other artists, writers, scholars based in the UAE. These were the early days of Campus Art Dubai. And the sessions were kind of moderated by art world professionals who were very generous with their time and really merciless with their critique. We had some remarkable conversations behind closed doors. And that's where I met archaeologist, academic, and mentor-in-chief Uzma Rizvi. I love her. She teaches at Pratt in New York. And she worked with me through my doubts and fears and kind of equipped me with very useful information on what to do next, right? So I started slowly with some internal presentations as well as some public programming in Dubai. And while I think that people did kind of care about what was being presented, a lot of people had no idea how to position or how to contextualize Zubeida Agha, right? They couldn't exactly Google a lot on her. Nothing really turned up. So all of these years kind of were really building towards me incorporating primary research as a tool and as a medium to kind of work through my creative objectives. And it wasn't much later that the Lahore Biennale Foundation, which I'm going to call LBF, the shorter version, announced its inaugural research in 2015. It gave me the exact impetus to apply, and I proposed the Zubeida Agha archive. The parameters of this was something that I wanted to do, but I realized in retrospect that it was totally unrealistic for the time frame and budget what I proposed. I had proposed fieldwork in Islamabad, seeking permissions, building trust with family, collecting material, sorting through a usable content, documenting it for digitization, then uploading the coherent content on a digital platform, which will also be designed and developed all in 6 months. Really, I still don't know what the hell I was thinking. I applied because I had the support and the push of people behind me, and that's always important. And this was an important opportunity because there was really no precedence for it in Pakistan, what LBF was doing at that time. But of course, beyond the will and the sheer kind of obsessive dedication that I have for the Zubeida Agha, I was not equipped, honestly, to take on a project of that scale. That too, while living in another country, working on a full-time job, and with very, very kind of little money to my name. However, LBF had kind of really great people and plans on board, and they were committed to making it work. Perhaps they too didn't imagine that my proposal was really too unrealistic in its ambitions, so they connected me to Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, where I was to travel and get a crash course in archives. And what an incredible experience, really. I mean, I loved the space, I loved the team and the people, and what I learned in those few short days, it was really life-changing, how I've approached a lot of things. And this is where mentorship or kind of these platforms are important, to make sure that you don't skip the line and make these mistakes. You kind of understand what you're doing. Anyway, this took a couple of months to happen, and it took another few months for the family to open up the house for me to access the material. Again, as a novice, I had greatly underestimated people's desire and right to privacy, right? I was cowboying my way, like, this is really important, this is great work that I'm doing, it's important for the nation. And I got a slightly lukewarm response, because at the end of the day, I was this family kid, and no one knew how to take that seriously. So it took a lot of time and gentle coaxing, a lot of trust building with her brother, Agha Arshad Ali, who was the guardian of her possession at that time, to have faith in my work. And honestly, it was terrifying, because I didn't know what would happen. But when he opened up, it was like a glass overflowed, and I suddenly had so much material to work with. So, all of this, a lot of the grant money went to the trip to Hong Kong and trip to Islamabad, and digital equipment that I got to streamline the barrage of material I was going through. And so I have to pause and recommend this to anyone who's doing any kind of research right now. I was lucky enough to have at least this kind of advice before I started. Do not trust your brain to keep all of this information. You have to keep photographing, tagging notes, compartmentalizing content as and when you go through, because coherence can come later, but the kind of detailed scrutiny that comes the first time around and this connection is hard to replicate, and it's unnecessary labor, which is unnecessary to repeat. Anyway, so between Hong Kong and the small and not even that expensive camera and my other trips to Islamabad and a couple of other things, I had burned through most of my grant money. So, the remaining trips to Islamabad and Karachi for digitization had to be self-funded. And I was too ashamed to ask for more, because I had estimated that amount was enough, right? And so, these are the things that I didn't realize that should have been said out aloud. Anyway, luckily, a whole week of work at the Citizens Archive in Karachi, including the use of equipment that was set up between Citizens Archive and Asia Archive in Hong Kong, and two team members of their office who were working alongside me 8 hours a day, every day, non-stop work. We sorted through mounds of data, which I had really thought was impossible at one point to kind of get down. And all of those logistical and financial costs were absorbed by LBF, as a Citizens Archive project. And that really, really made a difference, because I don't think I would have been able to do that on my own. Those two people who were there all the time just changed everything. And this is very sensitive equipment you're working with. It's not like you're just taking pictures. So it's very labor intensive. So just to be clear on the timeline, between Hong Kong and just the research trips to Islamabad, my 6-month period was already done from the when I was supposed to deliver the project. So, it was a few months to get a time at Citizens Archive, and another to secure kind of leave from my work, because I had a full-time job. And then the digitized files were handed over late 2016, which was almost a year after when they were supposed to be given. And then they were, Asia Archive needed time to process them and meta tag them. And then they had to hold on because they were launching a new platform and website. So all in all, what I'm trying to say is that, it finally was launched in 28 years later. And it's a really long time that was really kind of terrifying at that time. And I've realized now, I've learned that this is kind of how these things happen, and you have to realize that everybody takes time. So I had a lot of work-related support in Iftihar Dadi and Hamad Nasser, but I'm also so sure I must have been really difficult to work with, because I was literally learning things on the job. And so on the surface of it, I'm sure it appeared very messy, and clearly you can tell it was an epic failure in timelines. But all of those were major life lessons for me, because the commitment to the work remained steadfast. I was really committed, and I wasn't being lazy. But that's not enough in these kind of projects. And it was perhaps my inability to articulate my own frustrations and setbacks properly that I think with the team at LBF, that I regret the most, because I love people. But my skills are shit when I am frustrated with work, really. And I was pretty stupid about a lot of interactions that could have been handled better. And to give them their due credit, they were always very graceful in return. And I wish I could go back and rebuild some of that trust, right? And so one of the most important lessons that I've learned and would want to hopefully pass on to others is that trust is key. For any project, right? But especially ones you need to work with people who are either handing you over material or providing you the infrastructure. If you break that trust, it's very hard to recover from, and no matter how genuinely well-intentioned your objectives were, right? But putting all of that aside, the biggest gift of the project was kind of building an information bank that did not exist before. I mean, some of it did exist in oral histories, and that varied depending on who you spoke to. But in this archive, nothing is a supposition, right? Everything is drawn from documentation, and it brings me so much joy. So, I'm going to read a small blurb from what was generated, just kind of what was happening with the archive. So the archive provides a digital mapping of material that documents the work of Zubeida Agha in the role of a patron and an institution builder, an area that remains largely, like you said, unexamined, undocumented. It includes a selection of published texts, essays, catalogs, miscellaneous ephemera that surrounded her legacy, and also kind of gives an insight into the foundation building years of Pakistan. So some of the things that we already knew, but we were establishing through documentation was, Agha studied philosophy at Canade College in 1944. The same year, she joined B.C. Sanyal's studio, where she was learning painting. And, obviously the audience from India is going to be very familiar with B.C. Sanyal. In 1946, she went under the mentorship of Mario Perelinghieri, who was an Italian prisoner of war at that time. As things like that happen in South Asia. And he was very kind of instrumental in helping Agha break the academic disciplines of painting, really, and work with ideas. And that's what she came to be known for. And Agha does her first solo show at YWCA in 1949, which was also the first solo exhibition by any artist in a newly formed Pakistan, right? So that's very important. And also the first modern painting exhibition. And it became really controversial, and we found stuff in press that there was kind of this debate that raged on in the media, which was really interesting. And there's a little cartoon that I've shared here. And then Agha left for London in 1951, where she got a scholarship to study at Central St. Martin's. She was there for about 6 months, and then she got a solo show at a gallery there, Trafford Gallery. And then she moved to Paris, where then she wanted to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. And she had a solo exhibition there as well, and which we have documentation of this gallery, Henry Tronche, and I'm probably butchering the name. After which she, and these are important because what is happening with these exchanges? Who are these people going to these centers around this post-war time? And then she returns to Pakistan and settles in Karachi until 61, moving here and there. But from 61 till her death in 97, she kind of lived and worked between Rawalpindi and Islamabad. But what is really spectacular is what I learned from her institution building. So of course I had a bit of an idea when I went into the archive, but some of the revelations have been so stunning for me that I consider it almost criminal that it is missing from our art historical discourse, right? So I'm going to read just some of the things that she was involved with. She was closely involved with the formation of the early fine arts societies, either in capacity of board member or officer or partner, a participant. She was one of the founding members of the Arts Council Karachi, member of the Board of Governors of the Pakistan National Council of the Arts, PNC in Islamabad, which I will bring up a little further on. National College of Arts, Lahore, where I studied. Member of the Central Board of Film Censors, looking at films from across, all over. Member, Board of Directors of the Society of Contemporary Art. And then in 1961, she went on to become the Executive Director, Director of Contemporary Art Gallery Rawalpindi, the first kind of gallery in the country, which ran for 16 years, which is really, really important to kind of look at, right? These early histories. And then she went on to become the executive director on the committee that set up the National Art Gallery in Islamabad, which is the country's first institutional, place for visual arts. And, she's been quoted in print in what I found through press archives of how many works she donated from her personal collection and from the gallery to form the national collection of the country, right? These are all incredibly important things. I didn't know about this, and there's no way of accessing this information, right? So one of very other important other Pakistani master is Sadiq Khan, who is said to have donated over 200 works to the National Art Gallery. What happened to those works? How many of them are there? You see some, but how does one access that information, that archival history? That's really another chapter that I will forever remain very, but anyway. Coming back, I mean, this is amazing, right? This is really, really incredible. And this is what was keeping me going through very difficult kind of work that I was doing. But what I've never really talked about in relation to the archives and in public specifically, and we'll not go into a lot of detail about it now, but thought it was important at a side note, as this high was also happening, was that I was also grieving the loss of my mother, who had passed away due to like a prolonged illness. And I'd been a caretaker long distance and then in person during the kind of final months. And the unresolved grief, because I kind of came back to work less than a week after she passed away, and kind of the unresolved trauma that I went through drastically affected any semblance of discipline and my work-life balance. With coming with this baggage, every obstacle, big or small, in the process of this archive completely crushed me. It would become like this mountain that it didn't need to be. And I thought at that time that I was really doing a very bad job. And again, I had nobody to really talk to about these things. And I know that there's certain people out there who are going through similar things. And what I wanted to say was that I've learned to be kinder to myself, literally through the process of seeing how many other people kind of suffer from this. In my line of work, I've seen all kinds of professionals, all ages and experiences, going through a lot of personal stuff that's very hard to kind of collate with this kind of work. So not only was I hiding all of this from people and trying to cover it up, I think the people who did know were also not equipped to deal with that, and often told me to get on with it. Right? And I think that's very important to mention. As independent practitioners, our lives are, get entangled with this kind of work a lot. So when Akansha, when you asked me to speak about this practice, I remembered that. But also this gray area of artists working with research and us treating it like we would treat an artistic process. And I'm wondering if people are smarter now, or if they're savvier. Does a surplus of information on online help? Or is it too much to imagine that such a turn would happen within, less than a decade? Anyway, like moving on. So the third part is kind of looking at what does it mean to be able to use the archive to generate more content, right? And ideally, one hopes that what's been collected and documented and archived is not just to preserve information or safeguard something for posterity. For me, initially, it had been an attempt to kind of rectify the goals in our the gaping holes in our art history, to address the failures of our pedagogical structures, like I said, but in this kind of absence and this erasure, and also to reestablish like a legacy that was, that a person had spent their entire life building. And while these are very lofty goals, I also made like this very delightful discovery, which I think any seasoned researcher would already have known, but obviously I came to it late. Sorting through this material and processing, I realized that primary documents like these also help serve other minor histories, right, of other people, places, and times that existed either simultaneously or were overlapping. And so, in a manner of speaking, archival material, when dealt with sensitively or even intuitively, acts like a jigsaw puzzle in a way, right? So this is when I realized how much I love research and all what is possible and all that comes out of it. So, at the archives, I've been looking specifically into Agha's role as an institution builder, and I was largely sifting through material generated through her gallery days. But for the first time, really, I started reading about exchanges that were taking place between West Pakistan and East Pakistan, before the latter kind of succeeded to an independent Bangladesh in 1971. And so word of what I was doing was already kind of out. And I remember, I think it was around 2017, 18, I should have checked. Diana Betancourt and Amara Antilla kind of reached out and wondered if I was interested in participating in the Scholars Weekend at the Dhaka Arts Summit. And I really jumped at that chance, right? This was something that this is more my control. I can write, I can dig through these things. And I wanted to present these findings, at least the initial kind of stuff of these exhibition histories that I was able to generate through the lens of the contemporary art galleries in Rawalpindi. And so I want to share a bit of that research here today to show two things. One, how I was mining the research, but also how it was satiating my desire to actually understand and build alternative narratives to very problematically linear kind of histories. So I'll be reading a few excerpts and showing a few slides from that paper. So, from 1947 to 71, artists from East Pakistan developed a thriving and kind of dynamic relationship with galleries and institutions and audiences in West Pakistan. And after a bloody independence struggle in 71, this kind of ended all relationship between the two. And since then, discourse about Bangladesh in Pakistan, has become very one-dimensional and deeply censored. So while pre-1971 era publications like the Pakistan Quarterly, which, by the way, the archiving of which has been done by researcher Samina Iqbal, incredible. Everybody should look that up. And a few academic texts like that of Iftikhar Dadi do shed light on the 47 to 71 years. But the topic is really treated as marginal at best in Pakistani art institutions, right? So an NCA, which was established by the British in the 1875, despite its packed library and its own architecture and some of its staff actually standing witness to the events of 1971. Somehow this part of history was never really engaged with an in-depth manner my entire 4 years that I studied there. I mean, let me clarify, like, members of the community are not insensitive to this history, of course, and conversations are not uncommon. But it is a history contested and treated through selective amnesia, right? And that dialogue can be seen reflected in art education. And what are the younger lot going to take from this when they have nothing to kind of, they don't have this material to build from and understand what that history was. And in the public sphere too, much of the mutually shared ecology that was fostered between the two countries over 2 decades has been forgotten. And one is really hard pressed to kind of find books or catalogs or essays looking at this shared history of 24 years with relation to art specifically. And so here's what I think, what is really important in tracing the transnational development of modern art in global south, which a lot of people are working on. It is really imperative to kind of acknowledge that South Asian modernism cannot be fully understood without considering a more thorough examination of the movements between these two, and that jumping over 24 years of an ecosystem is doing disservice to building any kind of narrative. Again, these are the kind of things that I'm interested in, which is why I keep returning to these kind of topics. And because these histories are fraught with political and cultural violence and published material available is largely in Urdu or Bengali, making it inaccessible to scholars on each side who doesn't speak the other's language. It's not really an easy task, and I really feel like a better understanding of these years can help identify historical developments in the art of the region, right, and the transnational exchange. So anyway, my paper was looking at one such channel which supported the exchange of artwork and ideas, which was the Contemporary Art Gallery, Rawalpindi. So Agha was not only the director, she also played the role of researcher and curator and manager and accountant. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. And the gallery really helped create a platform for artists across East and West Pakistan, exhibiting works both nationally and internationally, connecting to all kinds of audiences, and encouraging a sort of cross-pollination in an attempt to work together as one nation. And from its time of its opening till it closed 16 years later in 1977, the gallery put up a staggering number of shows. So some estimates put this at over 200 shows. But today, very little or no documentation or literature exists on the programming and the impact of the gallery, or the knowledge that much of the gallery's collection was donated to the National Art Gallery. And so through this presentation, I kind of sought to introduce the history of the gallery and its engagement with artists in Bangladesh, as well as shed light on state involvement in the early art world years, nation building years. And the archival material obtained, one of the first documents I sorted were of the Fine Arts Societies of Pakistan, right? So the first exhibition organized by the Karachi Fine Arts Society was in 1948, and works from East Pakistan included 15 paintings by Zainul Abidin. And Abidin is considered one of the most important modernist masters of Bangladesh, having a prolific body of work spread across 4 decades, recognized for establishing the Dhaka Art Institute, etc. Right, and we know that from before that, Abidin was enlisted by the government of Pakistan in the Cultural Administrative Department in order to facilitate cultural development in East Pakistan, and hence the relationship with the West was very active and very public. And he was also, a regular participant in exhibitions in West Pakistan. This level of increased engagement might be one of the reasons that he's much more well known in Pakistan and taught about in art school. There's so many catalogs in the archives, and I began wondering, what was he showing? Who were his patrons in Pakistan? Should I look for the work he left behind? And it's truly a downward spiral if you're a rogue researcher like me. Like, everything seems interesting. Anyway, so once Agha set up the gallery in 1961, she started working from one room that was turned into an office space, and hand wrote or typed scores of letters to people all across Pakistan, right? And in a spectacular response, she actually started immediately receiving artworks in the mail. And in the surviving gallery documents, there are several portfolio images. So I don't have artworks, of course, and hand-typed bios and CVs from East Pakistan. And many notes, I believe, were written in collaboration with her brother, Agha Abdul Hamid, who was in the bureaucratic service, a board member of the Fine Arts Societies, and also a well-known art critic and writer at that time. So these, this is the slide I have right now, were drafted shortly before the time she was setting up the gallery, because these were compiled for a show that the government of Pakistan was putting up with the government of Italy to show at the cultural center there. And, she was kind of tasked with the process of putting it together and then taking it to Italy. And, was supposed to have works by the top Pakistani painters of the time, and supported by photography exhibition and films. And so, the exhibition took place in January to March 1961, and records show that it included 55 artworks, out of which 15 were from Karachi, 21 from Lahore, and 19 from Dhaka. And supporting the exhibit was an installation of 150 photographs, 45 transparencies, 2 films. And because of the availability of this material, correspondence, work lists, photographs, I believe it would be easier to trace more details around the exhibition and find out about the reception of the exhibition from press articles of the time and everything. So, so in the larger scheme of things, these are stories that should not be missing from our narrative. You don't have to care about research to know that. Later that year, the Contemporary Art Gallery opened, and in 1962 opened this massive show that was put together by Zainul Abidin, curated, and had like lots of artists and artworks. And I mean, I was only able to find out about it through a press clipping in the archive, or, you know, other catalogs of what was happening when works were then very little that I have of works being shown in Dhaka. And, you know, I found a press article, the only instance I've logged of actually Zubeida Agha's work there. And that is in no way a research, a result of an exhaustive kind of search. But I want to know more because this helps me strengthen her archive and legacy. And so just for this section, I just had these images that is a catalog from 1973 in the archives, which is very emblematic of how things change after 71. And, you know, the publication seemed to accompany kind of this comprehensive national exhibition of top painters across the country and shown in Islamabad, and then apparently traveled to other countries. But with East Pakistan now an independent country, all the familiar and recurring names are absent, right? And so the challenges of nation building and institution building in a newly independent countries is very complex. But for anyone who's really familiar with the lives and beliefs and ideologies of Faiz Ahmed Faiz and Zubeida Agha, it's not hard to ascertain that their presence on the selection committees must have been really, you know, bittersweet. So in a nutshell, this is the power of research and archive, being able to put together building blocks and also hoping that someone will come and play with them and hopefully lead to kind of further trajectories. And so here I just come to the final part of my presentation, which is quite short, which is the challenges of the after, like I said, and learning to share. And as I mentioned earlier, I have pretty much worked from the day I graduated till now. And I'm not saying that, oh, somebody needs to applaud me for that. Everybody does it. But growing up in a single parent household, that was a necessity. And it's been 17 years since, and the hustle doesn't stop. The reality is that bills have to be paid. And more often than not, independent writers and researchers like me have full-time jobs, writing, editing, and managing projects elsewhere. And sometimes it's work you love, and other times you hate it, on which I choke. But either way, what happens is that it doesn't really leave one with enough man hours to put in to continue the work, right? So I'm very specifically saying man hours, not, oh, I don't have the time or energy. It doesn't leave you with enough hours because like making art, researching and writing requires time to pause and absorb and to create various outputs. But where it becomes harder for us is artistic expression comes with a certain degree of freedom. Research, on the other hand, requires fact-checking, speaking to experts, asking for time, support, ensuring that what's being put out is not only factual, but is also well fleshed out. And so the archive took a lot out of me, and people don't realize how much work and responsibility it is. Because it's not like the art world is really known for its culture of care or acknowledging labor or mental health issues. But here's what happened, and which is amazing for me. Once the archive was up, people started reaching out to me for information, and sometimes it was seeking image permission rights, other times for content for their own research or talks. A lot of times it was students who had come across material they wanted to know more about. And a lot of times there were teachers across the world who were asking for material, setting up coursework. And sometimes what was really delightful was fact checking for other researchers where things were overlapping with their work, which I really enjoyed. And then these two examples that I've shared here, you know, you can see Charlotte Muir's text. She works at the Asia Art Archive, and she produces excellent kind of short text using documents in the archive. And on the right is a more recent piece that was done by Samira Bose for ASAP Connect, who a lot of people will already know, and she's the program coordinator for AA in India. But more significantly, so petty, I was in touch with a producer researcher who is working on a series of documentary shorts for the PNC, the Pakistan National Council of Art, an institution that I have spent years trying to connect to anyone with, but not once have I secured access to Zubeida archives or secured a meeting with anyone. And now someone working for them, even if on a project basis, and this lovely, lovely person reached out to me themselves. And I think for me, that really was kind of a moment, you know, and that's perhaps what's really galvanized me the most. Look at what happens when you Google search now, right? The amount of interest the primary documents have yielded, and not all of this is mine, of course, but the interest that's also been yielded. We unfortunately do not come, and I think this is like one of the more important things I'm going to say, is we don't come from a culture of sharing personal work and research, especially unpublished work. And I get the hesitation because content is plagiarized and is used without permission all the time. It was kind of funny when people were reaching out to me in the beginning, they were hesitant because they thought I would say no or I would be territorial. And obviously things have changed since then. But here, my goal to have any kind of ownership died a natural death. Of course, it pains me to no end when people use my work without citation and pictures are used from archive all the time. But I think there is so much more pleasure for me in having people talk about the work and legacy of Zubeida Agha, right? And this is what I want to end with today. Like, there is no big lesson from my presentation. I am not saying this is a good practice to allow. And no one has to assume Buddha-like calmness, really, when your work takes on its own agency and separates entirely from you. What I'm trying to say instead, especially to practitioners who are researching, is I learned to pick and choose my battles and realize some way through that the Agha archive cannot be the be all and end all of my work. It is too frustrating and too heartbreaking to dream about things and then not be able to go through with that, right? Whether it's money or time and even access. Or the fact that some people have actively tried to discredit my work or block projects coming my way. And I've seen that the lack of a pedagogy degree, I think, has definitely played a role in my perceived credibility. And I'm kind of to blame of also, absorbing that, blaming my lack for not being able to deal with it. But what I've learned from the art world is that it's always going to be cutthroat. I am not built for that kind of participation, and nor will I give into that kind of obsequiousness, right? Instead, I now utilize this skill set and experience in how I write essays, how I work on group projects, and how I engage with curatorial and advisory projects. Because at the end of the day, after nearly 2 decades of working with artists, curators, and writers across the world, I think I'm okay with trusting my instincts now, right? So she lived her life on her own terms, and so I guess so can I. Yeah, I guess that's it. That was really long, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Saira. Maybe you may want to stop the screen share so that we can delve into some questions. To audience watching us live, now is the time you can ask questions to Saira. So maybe I'll start the conversation. Thank you so much, Saira, for very candidly sharing your experiences and the processes, and also your work, and taking us through some of this ephemera and materials also of Zubeida Agha, which is a great introduction for those also who haven't engaged with the materials yet. What's very interesting is that you've literally built her CV, her curriculum vitae, and in the archive you actually see biographies of so many artists that she worked with, that she was writing and collating and putting together for presentations and work for other artists. So it comes full circle in that way. And what I find very interesting is, it is very much at this intersection of individual life journeys and singular efforts towards institutional thinking, at this intersection of personal histories and a nation, a culture's or a milieu's collective imagination or organization and representation. So it's at that intersection that one finds new pockets and spaces, and to locate some of these stories and anecdotes, and findings, of living practices. So I wanted to ask you about these living practice of a researcher, which is what you actually illustrated and demonstrated through your own experiences also, which are also difficult ones to talk about publicly. So I appreciate that. So the living practice of a researcher vis-a-vis versus the living practice of a past that one is documenting, archiving, and like in the simple pictures that you've put out, the presence of the researcher's hand, hair, arm is very much there. Like for me, over the years now, I've come to value subjectivity in research a lot. And it has taken me a long time and a process to come to that point. So I'm very curious about the representation you as a researcher choose to do, not treating archiving an archive as an artistic genre, and not even as a purely historical, distanced, or like a what do you say, a narrativizing, a simple narrativizing or exercise also in that manner.
I think it's really interesting that you've caught on to those little bits and pieces, especially a little bit of my presence in there, right? I'm very aware that the archive in its purely clinical form already exists on a platform like the Asia Art Archive, which is meant to carry out its role and duties as an archive, right? And so the clinicalness, high-res images, really completely removed of any opinion or biased text, just information, facts, 30 people checking, all of that is there. That is the content that has been produced for people who are either researchers or just interested or access. My role then has been to move back from it, right? Like I said, I'm not trained as a researcher. I went into it with very subjective interest and something that I was curious about and which informed my practice a lot, right? So I haven't talked about that, and I will not be, but a lot of my writing, like you introduced in my bio earlier on, I'm looking at a lot of feminist histories, but I'm also looking at alternative ways that artists work, and not necessarily directly through studio practices, but in writing, or as one of my friend in Lahore does, in gardening, and all of these different iterations that artwork is done. I also feel that my production of research then, right? So I'm not, now when I'm generating something, I'm very open about how subjective it is. This is my access to it. This is why I wanted to cover it. This is the direction I was pulled in, right? You and I could look at the same number of images and you could be pulled in another direction and I could be pulled in another direction. And that, I think, the beauty of the gray area that people like me operate in is that you can do that. Of course, if I'm supposed to be producing something for a journal or for a different kind of platform, I have to be very mindful. And these pictures of me in the process of photographing this archive are very important for me to use today. And I love that you caught on to that, because I didn't want to say it, but it is, we're talking about that journey and about it was a very, very personal journey for me. And I don't think there's any value in stripping that. Like, I also think that one should know that I'm related to Agha. It's kind of, it's better in a way, because it removes a lot of the biases that people might think that I have inadvertently put in and not told people what my interest is. So these are some of the things. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to also ask you about how the distinction that you make in terms of research roles and positions that you've taken with in relation to different exhibitions you've been invited to contribute to. So and then this archival work is on the other end. So yeah, so can you elaborate on that a bit? Yeah, with some examples of projects.
So there's a couple that you mentioned. I think specifically one of them that I really enjoyed working on was the importance of staying quiet, that I worked on with Umar Bhatt independently. We kind of he was invited to put up a show about Pakistan in Hong Kong. And a lot of these invitations are so loaded and also so like, what is Pakistan, right? How are you making these generalizations? Sorry, I just realized my face is really dark. I don't know if this is going to help. Okay, yeah. And so and Omar is always kind of interested in pushing these boundaries, and he's like, I want to do something, but let's collaborate on it together and use your research and look into something that's more meaningful, but also not something people have seen. And we ended up putting together this I loved working in that exhibition. We put together like 50 years of kind of conceptual practices of works that were minimal works that were produced by artists and not necessarily having minimalist practices. And that kind of conversation around, these conceptual threads that we were exploring. So I think that was very interesting. And both Omar and I were very mindful of not calling ourselves curators. It's a very loaded term. It's thrown around. Everybody's a curator. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with being a curator, right? There is a responsibility to the work, to the artist, to the audience, to the structure of putting things together. I'm not policing anyone. People can do whatever, but we were very mindful that this is again stemming from personal interest and content that we have access to, right? So we're not saying this is an accurate representation, but it is a pocket of representation. And so I kind of came on as a researching partner on that, even though we were working on everything. I think we were working on documenting things and making PDFs and like emailing people, and it was madness. But and installing works and everything. But the process, which took about 6 to 8 months to actually get to the point of getting the material, even before the show, the slowness. That is what the slowness is important. The ability to marinate with ideas and the ability to self-edit. See, that only comes at time, and that only comes with introspection, and it only comes with being able to talk to other people and somebody saying, this isn't right, or this isn't looking right, or actually maybe engaging you in conversation. So I think that project worked really well in that way. And in other projects, perhaps it's in creative nonfiction that I've done for a friend and an artist, Eamon, or other projects which have either been in film format or written format or exhibition format. I think what I'm interested in is then using my research to do background homework and then come at it as a narrator, narrating something. And then research is purely only a tool, not a medium, right? And then I take on a more authoritative tone, and I kind of assume different roles. So I think it varies. I think I've also realized that it doesn't serve anyone to kind of fit yourself into a mold. So one must always be doing everything. I have to do everything. I just really have to have my finger in every pie.
Yeah. Going back to Zubeida Agha archive again, bringing a public dissemination of this archive at this point in time, like not long ago, just 4 or 5 years ago, into the public domain, is also very, very, very critical and interesting, because it now gives an opportunity to locate it not just in a larger South Asian context, but also in the global art history context, where relooking is happening on different scales, where exhibition histories of South Asia and global South are being included in this other grander narratives and canons. So how do you see that framing, or how do you respond, or has there been attempts from your end towards that?
I feel various things about it. I think that she's really, it's a shame if any discourse kind of proceeds without her. And that's as black and white as I'm going to get about it, right? And one of the things that I feel very badly about, wow, that sounds like a very Trump way, badly, bigly. I don't feel very good about is my lack of being able to push her in, right? I'm not a seller. I don't know how to sell myself and my goods. I'm a producer. I make stuff, and I wish that I would be able to position in a way and put this in front of those people who I know who are exhibiting, writing, producing, doing all of this, right? And I'm like, look at this material, do something, right? I can't do it. I don't have the capacity to either curate that or put that together. I could in partnership with people if I had the right support. Because projects of this scale are really big. I know my limitations, which are financial, which are time-based, which is But this is what I say, like, this material is available. I'm saying it now, and I hope people are listening. I'm not trying to hold ownership over this material. I'm hoping somebody will come and work on it, right? Somebody comes up and says, oh, we're working on Zubeida Agha. I mean, so many people have sent me messages, Flana is written about. I'm like, what does it matter? Like, I don't own her. My journey was to get her out there. So this discourse that you're talking about, that pinches me, because I feel like, is this my lack that has not been able to get this material to them? Or why is she not interesting to them? Why is she missing? And forget everything, forget Zubeida Agha. Think about the representation of women artists at that time. And she was like a trailblazer at that time. So, she was definitely not the only one. Of course, you have Anna Molka before her, and you have Amrita Shergill, and you have all of these people. What I'm talking about is an institution building. Who, there were very few handful of women who were there and who were kind of doing this, and she's been removed from history. She's been kind of eradicated. The kind of content I presented today is evidence that this is the amount of, this is what she gave, and people don't study about it, people don't know about it. What do I do? Where do I I don't know where to start. That's my frustration. And the idea is, the more I talk about it, hopefully through platforms like yours, somebody else will get interested, and it will start at small pockets. So I'm not saying, hey, put on a grand survey. I'll say, why don't you get interested in doing this or doing that? I've had projects come my way, which I was really excited about, which got pulled away for whatever reasons. And COVID has not helped. Sorry, I'm completely rambling on. This is a very sensitive area for me. But I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just...
I don't know how to fix my light. I'm sorry.
Is there any question? There's a question from Vasavi. So she would like your response on two things. Did Zubeida Agha also write about art practices and exhibitions in her times? I mean, about her writing? If yes, what were they like? And then secondly, considering the rich and complex histories of languages within Global South and English being go-to language for dissemination of information globally, did you come across any interesting examples that challenge the positionality of language within your research practice?
Okay, so thank you, Oza, for this question, for the two questions. For the first one, I'd say there is definitely a lot of written material. A lot of it is very objective material. So, right, she is writing out detailed CVs and bios, of course, that I've mentioned. What I haven't included here is that there is very, very intense level of note keeping happening in how to develop institutions, right? So she's traveling across the world, visiting museums all across the US and in Europe and in Japan, and coming back with notes and suggestions on what are ideal ways to set up museum. How are you collecting? How are you archiving? How are you disseminating? What are these relationships that are happening? And those are incredible notes. And then she has her own personal notes as well. I don't have access to letters. Unfortunately, those were one of the few things that I don't have access to. There's some official correspondence. So I was given a very selective chunk of material. So I have nothing from her personal life and what her personal notation would have been like. But from work correspondence, a lot of the content is really incredible, and this desire to what we are studying and the kind of Western art history that we're studying and looking at, and how that's affecting, and to bring this kind of exchange. So yes, for sure, there is a lot of writing on exhibitions and art practices, but it's all for internal use. None of this is really published. Her brother, like I said, was an art critic and writer, so he's writing more prolifically. And so she has documentation of a lot of essays and things which are either about her or about the gallery, or sometimes just about the art scene. So those are really exciting. And then, so your second question is considering the rich and complex histories of languages. Oh dear. I don't know. See, so I don't know when at the time that she was operating that she's considering herself in this kind of global South narrative, right? We didn't know until a couple of years also ago. So I don't know necessarily that kind of language. And I think not specifically coming from her, but what is really interesting for sure is the essays that were developed for these catalogs by other writers, and because press articles were a lot of times just reviews, and the critique sections were very small. But the catalog essays are very interesting because, so, this is soon after independence for India and Pakistan, and then afterwards for Bangladesh also. So much of the dialogue is around nation building, about coming together, about what the soil is producing, about what we are going to build. And there's definitely, the role of the state is very different from how we imagine it today, right? So that's not something I favor now. And if you were to look at those histories from this lens, it seems problematic how much the state is involved. But you have to realize, like, these are literally fledgling institutions that are working together to write. So you have bureaucrats and you have artists and you have everybody working together to make something happen. So the language shifts between sometimes really problematic official nation building, identity making things, and sometimes very purely art world related concerns. So it's a lot of material that I wish that I, over time could engage with more.
Yeah, I think Vasvi is also trying to indicate Urdu as a language, or English.
Okay, I'm just
the go-to language. Yeah.
So I included like one text in there, which was that Urdu Zubeida Ki Musawwari, which I love so much, such a beautiful text. And I have press clippings in Urdu. This is what post-colonialism has done to us a lot. I can read and write Urdu perfectly. I cannot engage in conversation around art in Urdu. And that is something that we've been talking a lot about in Pakistan. And I've been seeing a lot of artists engage with that, the kind of terms we've learned in, and, so there's material that I struggle with. And those terms are hard. And I know that there are people sitting outside who would love to work with it. I mean, I printed some of these out, took them to, I used to work at the Sharjah Art Foundation for many years. And I know they deal with a lot of Urdu content for community building. And I just printed some of my stuff, and in lunch break went to this person who did this and sat with her. And I'm like, can you read through this? And so, yes, the language, both the language as Urdu and the language as content is very different. But again, I have very preliminary surface level access to that. And I will change that. That is the agenda.
Great. So one last question, maybe I get to ask, but I think there's another one coming. Yeah, so I was curious about the Zainul Abidin exhibition, which the very little material is around that. I mean, you talked about it briefly in your presentation. Are there more anecdotes that come to your mind immediately?
There was a lot of exchange, obviously, that was happening. It's
the one he curated.
Oh, not just that, but he was being shown a lot in the gallery, right? So there's a lot of correspondence. There's tons and tons of envelopes with photographs and slides of his work, and then that kind of back and forth. And then what was interesting was, in some of the catalogs of the shows, I found one which was a show that he had at the Karachi Fine Arts Society in, I'm thinking in 1955, I can't remember. And there are notes all over it. There are notes that I think that Zubeida Agha was writing, and interest shown by something Kawaschi. And Kawaschi is a very big Parsi family in Karachi. Interest showed by the Ford Foundation, somebody from the Ford family. And so these kind of notes, and I'm wondering what is happening with this kind of, that's where I was interested in the patronage and who was buying and who was interested. But what happened to a lot of artworks, right? So this area is so shady that from what I hear, again, from oral histories, what happened post 71, that a lot of people just packed up and left, artists. And a lot of the artwork kind of just, not the art communities weren't such that they would get rid of the artworks, but it's kind of disappeared from popular imagination. And so there is such rich level of engagement with him across both East and West Pakistan. And he's obviously taught about it in NCA. So there's a lot of material in the archives that kind of is about him. So yeah, I don't think that was a really good answer. But I'm really liking what Isaac has asked.
Yes, so I'll read it out for everyone. Is it possible to be critical in a family history? A public family album may not have anything negative or sad memories. The photo album may always be happy.
I'm so glad that you've asked that. I think it is incredibly difficult to be critical in a family history for multiple reasons. I have enough distance from her. She passed away in 97. A lot of my relationships with her were much earlier. And then recently, Mirna Ayad had done a text about it for the National that I sent a link to you, Akansha, about my relationship with Zubeida Agha. But I think I had enough distance. I did grow up with a sense of hero worship, and I never understood why nobody outside got it. But that was there, and then it eventually dissipated because nothing really happened. And when I returned to it later, it was very difficult to return to it critically. There's a lot of toes you have to tread on to be critical, right? Whether you're saying this was right or this was wrong, or these artworks are actually very, I mean, I don't like all of her artwork. I love her and I love her work. I don't like all of her paintings. And for me to be able to say, oh, actually, I don't like this painting. I mean, I can say it in a very broad way, but with artworks is very difficult. But I get your point about a public family album, right? So my research, the archive, was very specifically looking at the role of the gallery. And I was given access only to material for the gallery, which are official letters, documentation, phone bills. There is nothing personal that's come out. So I haven't been able to comment on anything personal about her personal life, her personal attitude, her relationships with other artists, how successful she was, how she failed. I do know in retrospect where she failed in many ways because she didn't really correspond to what a lot of social and cultural ideals were for a woman, you know, and even an artist. But I am always quick to say my relationship so I can kind of show that bias. But I agree. I don't think there's a chance to be 100% critical in a family history, but I'll tell you this, if you meet a researcher who is not related to the person they're working with, they too will have a bias because they have gravitated to that person for a reason. And so that will always remain. But what we can change is always allow our content to be open to critical assessment. कितनी मैंने बातें कर ली हैं? Honestly, I feel like I've been yabbing on.
This has been super engaging. So that's it. Maybe from our end, we are also
oh no, we lost you.
Time limit set for us. So maybe, yeah. So I mean, do you have any last comments? Anything? I'm
just glad people join in. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Saira, and thanks to everyone who stayed on and engaged. So more coming, more sessions of researchers practice coming in December. So see you next time then. Thank you so much, Saira.
Thank you. Bye. Ciao. Bye.